This is the story of the Fokker F-28, F-100 and F-70 series of aircraft. Piedmont Airlines, back in the day, it's something I witnessed when a pilot seems to have broken the rules very badly and set a record that he never got credit or punishment for setting. This is a very engineering-oriented video. It is long, necessarily. I mean, I could tell the story just short. I got on the airplane, this happened, this is what I experienced, this is what I witnessed, this is what I timed with my own stopwatch. And everybody would say, "You're full of stuff." And then I'd be in the comments on YouTube answering lots of questions, and then they'd say, yeah. You're just saying that to back up your story. So I'm going to give all the backup as I go. To me, it's interesting. Been around aviation for a long time. I earned my first aircraft lesson, gull-wing Stinson, when I was 14 years old, by being the only one who could figure out how to get it to start on a cold February day. It happens to have the same starting system as a Model T Ford, which I happen to know a lot about at that age. I'm not that old, I just had a spark coil in my workbench. So, always stuck with aviation, and I've designed various parts of air traffic control computer systems. The interfaces to, what is that acronym? ICAO? ICAO? Interface for the Check-Lap-Kok Airport in Hong Kong. Worked for a bit at Langley. Is it called Langley? Lakewood FAA Research Center. Same airfield where the Hindenburg blew. Working on air traffic control computers, the new interface. So I learned a lot about air traffic control and the computers thereof, which bears into this. And I was an observer of all this. But I spent a lot of time flying up and down the Appalachians on Piedmont Airlines. Now, there were two airlines that were commonly known as the Vomit Comet because of the route up and down the Appalachians. It is a bumpy route because the air is always disturbed by flowing over the mountains, by thunderstorms, by everything. You bounce a lot. Also, back in the 80s and 90s, when this story is about somewhere in the late 80s or about 90, I haven't been able to remember exactly when it happened. Very likely just around 90, when, for a brief period of time, Piedmont had taken delivery of a couple of F-100s before. US Air bought them out. It's another story. But they were the competitors, and you could tell, besides the colors on the airplanes, you could tell them apart. Because US Air always had two engines under the wings, and Piedmont always had two engines in the tail. And that goes into part of the story, because back in the 70s, 80s, there was one kind of pilot that they liked to hire, and that was pilots who liked Douglas. Specifically, McDonnell Douglas F-4s. They hired F-4 pilots that had mustered out of the military. And if the scuttlebutt was that if you had flown F-4s as wild weasels in Vietnam, they would make a place for you. And that is how they flew. Kind of like the Braniff Navy flyers, when they You could tell when they came in for a landing because they were always trying to get the hook, get the hook, get the hook down. Nose high, tail low. They were a bunch of cowboys. A lot of people hated Piedmont. A lot of people loved it. I loved it. I loved it enough that I had a club membership with them. I was doing a lot of engineering that took me up and down the Appalachians. Computer engineering. And I'd be flying down to North Carolina from Maryland a lot. So I knew the route really well. You flew up and down the Great Valley, particularly coming back up on Friday afternoon, you flew the Great Valley. That takes you through Roanoke and so on, all the way up to Chambersburg. Why Chambersburg? Back in the day, before the computers were as good as they are now, air traffic control was a very difficult job. And they had to do some manual things just to straighten the mess out. And one of the things they did was on a Friday afternoon when it was really busy, I mean like every Friday afternoon, they typically were using runway 14. Now that is runway 14 right at BWI, which is now the Thurgood Marshall Airport. But they would use runway 14 and they would start the parade at Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. That's a long way off, but they could just line everything up and nobody entering that parade at Chambersburg was going to interfere with similar lines coming into National Airport, now known as Reagan or Dulles. All right. I knew that pretty well because it went right over my house. I'd be coming home on a Friday afternoon from a week of engineering in the Carolinas or being in Nashville and changing at Charlotte. And I'd fly right over my house and see my little boy in the yard coming in to 14 from Chambersburg. It's part of the story. So, they liked McDonnell Douglas aircraft at Piedmont, but them DC-9s is a bit big because they were trying to have more and more and more flights, and more flights per day, more airports. DC-9 was just a little too big. So they started buying Fokkers. The Fokker is an excellent little airplane. And they flew them different than the manual suggests. The manufacturer suggests that you do not use the dive brake for speed control on landing, even though it's available. The Fokker was designed for short routes in Europe. Specifically, the speed brake, they say, was designed so that they could get into London City Airport, in downtown London on the Thames, so that it would descend steep enough to go in there. And then it was added as an afterthought. But it was a great thing because in those days we didn't have wind shear detectors at the ends of our runways. We had a lot of deaths because of that. We didn't understand wind shear very well, and we certainly didn't understand microbursts. We just had a lot of situations where airplanes on final approach got into deep trouble when there were thunderstorms overhead or in the area. Piedmont had a solution to that with the Fokker. They had a standard operating procedure that you did all of your landings at full tow-go power. That's take-off, go-around power. And the speed brake all the way out. And that's how you controlled your speed with the speed brake. Oh, but that's uncomfortable for the passengers. That's right. You're sitting there and you go, whoo, ooh, whoo, whoo, every time they touch that speed brake. But we were flying the Vomit Comet. You're bouncing around all the way through the flight. What's the difference does it make when you're landing to get bounced around a little more by the speed brake? The nice thing is we knew it was safe because we knew that if there was a wind shear, we didn't even know the name microburst back then, that pilot was going to slam that speed brake in and we were going to go around so fast. But Nice airplane. I love it. Speed brake has nothing to do with this story. Just I love that airplane. The F-100, it says in Wikipedia, which is very incomplete on the subject, says that it has an improved supercritical wing. This does come into the story. Now, does that mean that the F-28 had a supercritical wing and this is an improved one? I think so. Or does this mean that the F-100 had an improved wing which was supercritical? Now that's a problem. It's a problem because the flattening of the supercritical wing caused a lot of trouble for the F-100. Very tragically, people died. Turns out that it collects ice under certain atmospheric conditions to the point where you really shouldn't fly those things in local winter anywhere, in local winter north of the Tropic of Cancer, or local winter anywhere south of the Tropic of Capricorn. You might ice your wing and lose control. It's bad. But as long as you don't do that, it's a great wing. Now, why would you want a supercritical wing? Well, there's this thing called critical Mach number. Varies from airfoil to airfoil, from plane to plane, but it's somewhere in the ballpark of Mach 0.7, that is 7/10 of the speed of sound, locally in the particular air pressure, density, temperature that you happen to be flying. And shock waves start appearing on the wing. And they cause drag. And since the Fokker was built to get up to altitude quickly, flying from like Hamburg to Frankfurt. Whoop, go up, whoop, go as fast as you can, and get back down. Fuel efficiency, this is not a long distance plane. You're going to waste so much fuel getting up and going down that the amount that you don't get, but you do want to be able to go a bit faster. So you use the supercritical wing so that you can eke a little bit more speed out of it in level flight in your cruise. You're not getting into a unsafe condition. What unsafe condition is that? Well, when you hit critical Mach number, you can get those shock waves. Those shock waves can move back on the wing and start making the wing being pushed down in the back, pushing your nose up, and everything goes divergent in several axes at once. It's not nice. It is part of what was called back in the 1940s the sound barrier. Planes would go faster and faster, and suddenly they would just fly apart in midair, as if they had hit a wall. Actually, they went unstable because of critical Mach number in many cases. So you have a wing that can handle this by eliminating the control issues that happen at critical Mach number. So you can fly at 7/10 of the speed of sound if you so desire. Maybe up at 8/10. Kind of like the old, was it BAC 111 or whatever? That old thing that the British used to have that had 4 engines and a tail that flew so fast. Or the old Convair that flew so fast. But supercritical wing is also used on jet fighters. Wonder where Fokker got the idea how to build such things. Funniest thing about that. I mean, if you already know how to build that kind of airfoil, why invent a new one for your airliner? It is said that the Fokker F-28 is just an enlarged version of a certain European fighter jet. I'll believe that. So one day, but the pilots on Piedmont were cowboys. Flew a lot out of airports that didn't have a whole lot of flights back then. So we'd be the only ones there, and you'd be coming out, and they'd be going through the safety procedure as fast as they could because they'd been told to get through as fast as they could. The moment that they sat down, it would be about when the pilot got his landing clearance, and we were still on the taxiway, and the throttles would go forward, and we would begin to accelerate. And what? Are you going to take off from the taxiway? No, we would take that greater than 90-degree turn into the runway like a Corvette. And you'd be leaned over on your seat as you went around the corner, and down the runway you went and took off. Is that legal? Probably not. Would they get in trouble doing that today? Yeah, I think they would. But is that the way they flew? Sure enough, it was. So we're on one of those flights, and the other thing that always happened for everybody flying that route was by late in the day, you were late. Air traffic control, lost baggage, all that stuff, and if they'd already flown 6 little flight legs before they got to you, you're running 30 minutes late, 40 minutes late, an hour and a half late when you get out of the gate. And we were running late that Friday afternoon, more than an hour. And we take off. Pew, around the corner, out we go. Get up to altitude. Pilot gets on, says, we're delaying the drink service, or maybe he said to the crew, cabin crew, please suspend the drink service. We're flying at such and such an altitude, and I don't remember whether it was 20,000 feet or 11,000 feet. It was above 10,000 feet. That makes a big difference. Flying over more or less somewhere between Charlotte and Roanoke. And he said we're suspending, no drink service. We'll get back to it. Please fasten your seatbelts. He said, we're running late. I know. I apologize for that. I'm going to try to make up some speed. So I'm going to be descending below 10,000 feet down to 8,000 feet. And we're going to try to make up some time. Okay. We're going to go below 10,000 feet to make up some time. Huh. What? Now, I had that once or twice before in Dash 7s, four propellers on the wings, because they would drop down to VFR and they have all these air traffic delays because basically not enough air traffic controllers to keep track of all the little counters on the maps, and they're just putting people in holding patterns. And we went down below 10,000 feet, you're no longer under control, you're on VFR, Visual Flight Rules, which means it's your job not to hit anybody or anything. Some other things about that I learned later from air traffic control. And that is that some of the things they watch for when you're up there in controlled airspace, that the computer calculates for them, where it looks at where you are and says, here's what the airspeed is. They don't calculate that. Or at least they don't look at it. As far as they're concerned, you're on your own. I didn't realize that, I don't think, back then. I just knew that he was trying to get down below so that he didn't have to say, no, you're going to get vectored way over there instead of the route you want. VFR, you're on your own. And it was a clear day, I think it was in the winter. Clear, calm, smooth air. Unusual in the Appalachians to be smooth air like that. So he takes that airplane and he does a pushover. Nose right down. And I mean a real pushover. I mean, we almost go weightless. We're down to like 2/10 of a gravity or something. 1/10. We're not weightless, but it's close. And he pushes it down, and you can hear the engines winding up. The roar gets louder, goes, But also you hear that thin whine, that's the turbine whine, you know, ee! You always hear in a jet engine, an E, and it goes from E to E, you know, it's winding up, and he's going down. That's interesting. I'm looking out the window like I always do. I've got my map on my lap like I always do, because I learned to recognize cities. I just loved, that's what I did. I would recognize the cities as I went. Let me see if I can see that landmark. Let me see if I can see that landmark. I want to know where I am. So I'm keeping track of the cities as I go. I don't remember today what cities it was, but I was paying attention that day, as usual. And he noses over, and he's noticeably going faster, and that turbine whine is getting higher and higher, and the engines are roaring, and then they go, whoop! It's like a flame out. That's odd. It was just like when you flip the switch on an oxyacetylene torch, and the flame that's going, silence. It's like a noise unto itself, the sudden silence. That's odd. So I put my cheekbone up against the window frame, and I can hear the engine. I can hear the roar. I can hear the whine, but you can't hear it coming through the window like you usually can. I mean, usually you get your ear closer to but not touching the window, you hear the roar more. But not this time. Huh. That's odd. Is he doing what I think he's doing? Nah, he couldn't be. Alright, where are we on the map? Make a note. Set the timer on my digital watch. And off we go. And I kept track of the time, watched the cities go by, and we were noticeably going faster than usual. Now there's another thing about going down below 10,000 feet. That whole stretch has got one space after another that's sort of kind of semi-restricted. It's not really restricted, but it's sort of like shared use because it's used by the Air National Guard and by several air stations in North Carolina and so on. It's used for practice, which means they sometimes get permission to go supersonic as they practice. Because it's way out in the middle of nowhere where people don't care a whole lot. Not a whole lot of people complaining. And mostly they get their house rattled and they go, go do it! Save us from those commies! You know, that kind of people. Alright. And that was back in the day. But I said, I'm going to time this thing. Sure enough, we get to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. The nose angles up. Suddenly the roar of the engines comes back. But as the roar of the engines was coming back, I had already noticed that the whine of the engines was lowering in pitch. So we make a hard right turn over Chambersburg. We joined the parade and we made an uneventful landing. But on our way down, he says, he gets on the intercom and says, well, I only managed to save about 27 minutes on that speed run. That's what he called it. But I hope that that makes your schedule for the rest of the day a little bit better. We're still running 40 minutes late and blah, blah, blah. And that's the story. But I had noted down when we slowed down and what city we were over. I did the calculations. I did the calculations 7 different ways based on what errors might have been in there. And he had told us the altitude. I don't remember what it is. I think he said we were at 8,500 feet above sea level when he said we're going to cruise for a bit. I left that out of the story. I did do some looking up, speed of sound at altitude and temperature and so on. We were somewhere between, by my calculations, Mach 1.0 and Mach 1.1. That is highly illegal over the landmass of the United States. I'll grant that right there. You're going to say you can't do that. That jet, even most fighters can't do supercruise. What's supercruise? Supercruise is to go supersonic in level flight without an afterburner. Well, there's no way it can get past the sound barrier. Well, they don't say sound barrier anymore. But above critical Mach number, there's another, I forget what the name of it is. But basically, it's the point at which the drag goes maximum, somewhere near Mach 1. With all those shock waves forming over the wing, you do have a maximum. And there's just no way that those engines are powerful enough to get through it. And you're right, they are not. There's no way that those two engines on the back of that Fokker, whether it's F-28 or F-100, I'm not sure. I think it was F-100, could push that plane through that high drag zone. Why do you think he dove it? He converted altitude potential energy into kinetic energy, speed. Because that was the only way to push it through the high drag zone and get into the low drag regimen above Mach 1. But those engines, yeah, that's right. I learned from a pilot later that there's different ratings on the engines, and if you push that lever past a certain point, you have to put it in the log that you were past and how many minutes. And typically, they say you can only go 10 minutes at this notch, and you can only go 3 minutes at that notch. And if you go more at some other notch, it's not quite that much. If you go more than 20 minutes, you have to log it, and they have to change when they're going to do maintenance, and they're going to have to do maintenance, 3 months sooner than they planned. Something like that. Yeah, those engines were not happy. But why at low altitude? Turbojet energies are more effective at low altitude. No, the book says they're more efficient at high altitude. Yeah, that's right, they're more efficient at high altitude. I said effective. I said it was about engineering. If you're trying to see how far you can go, how fast, on how much fuel, you want to be at high altitude. And you very efficiently convert fuel to energy and push your aircraft through the very thin air of high altitude. At low altitude, what's happening? You're pushing more and more air, too much air into that turbine, and if you put enough fuel into it, you will get a whole manure load of energy. And it will push hard because you have more air going into the engine. Oh, but the engines are not designed for that. You ain't supposed to do it. I'm sure that his EGR was way up past the red line. Those burner pots were running white hot, and he burned a humongous amount of fuel. Like I said, he broke all the rules. But he proved his point. Once you punch it through with a dive, that Fokker, with its supercritical wing, it can supercruise. And that's the story of the Supersonic